Hey guys, today we're gonna attempt and fix my Miya gouache. Last time I used these, I talked about how they felt weird and a little bit sandy, like the texture of them. They weren't really dry, they were still creamy when I got them out of the palette, but the consistency is just so weird. It really is just like sand. Colors wouldn't mix together and I'd get these different colored streaks when I paint with them, so it's been really weird. A little bit of context on these. I got them September of last year, so I've been painting with them for a few months now, but the first time I got them I never fully opened them. I just opened them just a little bit and took my palette knife and scooped some paint out of them before I mixed them in my palette. I also did some swatches and put them on top of the lid so it would be easy for me to keep track of all the colors. But yeah, that's how I've been using my gouache this whole time, and it's been okay. But last week when I did my Beth Harmon video, I noticed that it had this different consistency, so now we're gonna try and fix it. One of you guys suggested that I put a little bit of water on them and mix it up with my palette knife, so that's what I'm gonna do. The colors don't all look the same. Some of them are still very wet, like the blue and the red, while this mustardy yellow and the brown is barely holding on. So I don't think it corresponds to how often I use them, because this blue I just use so much that you can see it's the color that has the least amount of paint left on it. And the red is my favorite color, so I just try to use it as much as I can. So yeah, I'm just gonna open them all up and see which ones I need to put water on and mix up. I'm actually very happy that I did this because now I can see the colors better, and I'm very inspired to use some of these colors. Most of them I never even thought about using. Like, I love how all of these greens look. They're very different and can't wait to paint with them. Today we're just gonna paint with the same colors that I used on my last video, because those are the colors that I know feels weird. But I'll definitely be using some of these colors for sure later on. So yeah, I'm adding a little bit of water from my palette knife and putting them all in. I'm waiting a few minutes before I really go and mix them up, to just really wait for the water to settle into the paint. This mustardy yellow is the hardest to reactivate, because even when I got it wet enough, it still felt sandy. It's not really the fact that it's dry that makes it hard to paint with. It just feels like it's separated and it's hard for me to get it back to its normal texture. So yeah, this color is giving me a hard time, so I had to repeat the process a couple of times for that. And I did avoid doing this for the colors that are already wet and feels normal. Like the blue one I never touched at all, but some of these colors like the brown and the mustardy yellow, like I said, I had to do a couple of times. So after that, this is what they all look like. They all look like they're at a good consistency. Well, basically, they all looked like how they did when I first opened them. So now I am painting with the same colors that I did for the last one mostly. None of these colors feel any weird at all, but when I did scoop out the mustardy yellow, it's a little bit creamier compared to the other colors that are more on the looser side. But when I go to mix them in my palette, they are mixing together really well with the other colors. There's not any gritty, sandy feeling when I do that, so it's already feeling great. I'm paying close attention to that neutral brown that I did for the background, and the yellow especially, because they were the hardest to work with the last time. But even with those colors, they all still feel the same, so I'm guessing the process worked. The only bad thing about fully opening them is that every time I open the palette up, the paint would get everywhere and it's really messy. It's very inconvenient, so you have to go through the process of cleaning everything up before and after you paint with them, or else you just get paint everywhere like I did with my hands. And also the palette has to be super clean before you mix anything on them, because these colors are very easy to contaminate. Like if you have the slightest amount of blue in your palette or in your brush and you're trying to mix a bright orange, that orange will get dulled down into this grayish color. Like what happened with those initial layers that I did for the highlights on her face. It looks a little dulled down and grayish. That's because I had some blue in my palette. So I want to talk about this painting a little bit because I'm not gonna lie, after I laid down the first few colors, I got really stumped and I didn't really know where to go with it. This was the day after I painted over my watercolor painting, and I think that's why. Maybe I looked at it from a watercolor perspective initially that I wasn't really thinking when I first sat down and painted this. So I just put down those colors on her face without really thinking that it wasn't gonna blend as easily as watercolor does. So yeah, it kind of took me aback a little bit initially. But if there's anything with gouache, it's that there's comfort in knowing that you can always layer over your mistakes if you make them. And another thing is that they always settle down when they dry, because lighter colors will dry darker and darker colors will dry lighter, so it's not always going to be as crazy as it looks like when they're wet. I think that goes for most paintings. You just really have to trust the process while you're doing it and not get frustrated when you don't get the results that you want when you first start out. So yeah, you guys, this gouache is acting as it should. It feels like the colors are already mixing together in the palette really well. There aren't any visible streaks with different colors when I paint with them. It's really starting to like painting with gouache now. One of the reasons why is that you can go over your mistakes when you make them very easily. A good example is how her eye is looking very wonky at this stage, but I know I can just go ahead and paint over that later on when it's dry. One thing with gouache is that you really have to make sure it's super dry before you go over and finish it off, or else you'll risk reactivating your paint like that. And also make sure there's not a lot of water when you layer them, because that will just affect what's already underneath that. So you just really have to be very careful with gouache. Kind of crazy how, because it's so easy to fix your mistakes with gouache, that your painting kind of goes through so many stages, and it feels like I could have stopped at a lot of these points and still have ended up with something that looks like a finished piece. But because it's so easy to go from dark to light with gouache, I could just go ahead and layer as many times as I want to make it look like as close to what I have in my head as possible. So yeah, this is really sweet. I'm having a lot of fun, and I'm really enjoying painting with gouache at the moment, almost as much as I enjoy painting with watercolors. So I'm really happy about that, and thank you guys for telling me how I could fix my gouache, because I would have been really frustrated with it otherwise. The only problem now is that it got super messy when I paint, and it just gets everywhere in my palette and on my hands. So if you guys know of a way I can contain them and keep them nice and neat, I would really appreciate some advice on that. This has been super fun. I like this little painting that I did, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching me paint it, and I'll see you again soon.